lives in East Atlanta with her husband, Rodney, and their children. April is expecting in January, so that's exciting. And her hobbies include hiking, biking, yard work, volunteering, reading, cooking, and learning TikTok dances with her bonus daughters.
Nice. And at the very end of the presentation, we're going to show you some of those dances, so stick around. So actually, I'm going to start with Bette. If you could kind of give us some context, like what are we looking at right now, and talk about where's Broad Street in relation to the rest of the town.
So the picture we were just looking at was a shot taken on Broad Street, just across from the Atlanta City studio, looking north towards 5 Points MARTA Station. But more generally, Broad Street is located downtown and is about 3/4 of a mile long. It terminates at Garnett Station, which you can see on this context map. And on the north, it terminates where it intersects with Peachtree Street. So its northwest and southwest segments are bisected by the 5 Points MARTA Station, making the street one of the most central and transit-connected streets in the city. It's less than half a mile from Georgia State, adjacent to Woodruff Park, and runs between various historically significant buildings such as the Healy Building and Historic Riches Department Store. It is all home to the Broad Street Boardwalk, 5 Points Station Soccer, the Murmur Gallery, and the Atlanta City Studio, just to name a few.
Great. And speaking of historical buildings, the street actually has some great history, and I think April might be best to talk about some of that historical info.
Yes, I would love to. I honestly could spend this entire hour talking about the history of this neighborhood, but to condense it to just a few short minutes, essentially Broad Street is just a little over a block away from where Atlanta actually began. And so through its prime of development in the late 1800s, Broad Street essentially became a market street. It was downtown, was hitting its prime. The street directly to its east was Peachtree and was really attracting the bigger department stores. And so Broad Street attracted the smaller ones and really became a market street. Let's see. So if you go back really quick, sorry, talking low. So these photos were taken in the 1900s and just show the dynamic use of the street. So it was built for multiple transportation modes, really wide streets and sidewalks, 2- and 3-story buildings, and really just provided daily needs for those around them. If you go one more, in this photo, you can see the Cotton Gin Seed building, which for those of you who are history buffs, you can actually see that sign at the History Center today. But this was taken in the 80s. And while Peachtree, again, was the main shopping street, this street thrived until 5 Points actually came to town. So if you go to the next one, what you'll see is as the city began planning for our central transit station, 5 Points, it literally created this physical divide between North Downtown and South Downtown. It was unfortunate because not only was the construction long, it took about 10 years, but then even when in the next photo, when Broad Street was open again in the 80s, the damage had already been done. So many of those retailers that had thrived on Broad Street for years and years had already moved out and closed down because of the decline of foot traffic. So it was a very sad move for Broad Street South. And unfortunately, the street was never given the ability to rebound. So in the 80s, Riches moved out of their headquarters. In 87, Cotton Gin Seed moved. And so continually over those years, stores closed and buildings just became neglected. Now, thankfully, neglect means that they weren't torn down. And so what we're sitting with today are the same 2- and 3-story buildings that line the streets, really favorable sidewalks and wide streets. And just the opportunity to, with our partners on this call and MARTA and the City of Atlanta, really rethink Broad Street as a vibrant heart of the city again. So grateful to be in that position and talking about that today.
Thank you so much. So now we have a quick poll. I think it's going to pop up for you, for anyone who's joined us through Zoom. If you want to say, what do you think of when you think of Broad Street? What comes to mind? It may be something not on this list, but of these options, which one resonates with you the most? And then once we get a majority of answers in, we will take a look at the results. So lively, a great place to eat and socialize, poorly maintained, accessible, or needs improvement. If you guys would pick an option that most describes what you think. And so, okay, needs improvement looks like it's the most popular, and a little equally spaced with the other ones, with a great place to eat and socialize coming in next. Okay. So we have one more question to pop up, and let's see here. I've seen the same question from, let's see. Popping up. How often do you go to Broad Street? Once a week, once a month, every 3 months? Let's say this question pre-pandemic, because I know lives have changed a lot in people's movements. So let's pretend like this is 2019 and you're answering this question. With this question, we wanted to get a sense of, people in this panel, how many have been there, how often are people interacting with Broad Street. So if you want to submit your answer, we'll look at the results. Okay, so a lot of you have been here. I'd say the majority have been at least once, the vast majority. For those 17% have never been, we invite you to come. Hopefully this panel will entice you to come take a look at what we're talking about for this hour. Okay, so thank you guys for participating in that. So now let's kind of zoom out a bit and get philosophical for a second. What is public space and public life? I know that's a big question. And what do these ideas mean for Broad Street? And I'm gonna first call on Bette for this.
You watching this?
Sure. So just generally, public space provides the setting for public life to
Well, at
unfold.
some point it'll be available.
These are spaces such as parks, streets, sidewalks, and public life includes the activities and connections made in these spaces. So public life can really cultivate a sense of community, which more broadly is what we hope to continue to build on in downtown by working to make it more accessible and welcoming for people and improving how people move through and interact with our public spaces.
Great. And Wesley or April, do y'all have any thoughts on kind of what is the big picture philosophy of public life and how that might relate to Broad Street?
I'll add, specifically on the heels of your comment about our activities pre-pandemic, that I think that it's a critical part of our culture and society that we have these spaces where we can gather and come together and celebrate and, I don't know, cheer and what's been happening, protest. All of these are critical aspects of our society, and these spaces provide the stage to do those things.
Yeah, and I'll say from an investment standpoint, Broad Street was certainly a major attraction for us when we began evaluating projects. That, some of the constraints we already mentioned, the fact that it's a 3-block long street, South Broad Street specifically, the two transit stations makes traffic flow already really light. And for us, investing in an urban core of a major city, the pedestrian experience is one of the things we think about the most. And so just those natural inherent things make Broad Street really exceptional for the city. It's very unique to anything else. And then you have these like really interesting elements, the canopies that we call them, but they were put up for the '96 Olympics. And I might be going into too much detail, but there's just some really interesting character traits about Broad Street that we feel make the street inherently feel really special. So our vision for that street has always been, using those things and building off of them to create a great public space for South Downtown.
Awesome. Thank you guys. So now let's move a little more concretely, or let's say woodenly, because I want to ask you guys about the boardwalk, the new boardwalk. It's was built about 2.5 years ago, and I'd love to kind of hear details about how that came about and some of the nitty-gritty inception details. And Bette, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a fairly long history leading up to the Broad Street Boardwalk becoming a pedestrian-only space. And the motivation for transforming this area began with the goal to make the Broad Street intersection safer for pedestrians. And so the city sought to really do this by taking a series of steps to change the 5-way intersection of Peachtree, Broad, Lucky, and Auburn. So in 2016, planters were used as bollards and placed at the north entrance to Broad Street to block cars from entering. And although this improved the safety of the intersection, concerns remained because the space was still accessible to cars that would travel down connecting streets in search of parking. So in the spring of 2017, the city advocated for additional measures that would make the northernmost block of Broad Street 100% pedestrian only. And the Atlanta City Studio created a concept design that would act as an interim solution. And the aim was to create a space that would be inaccessible to cars, but more broadly and importantly, to build an exceptional place for people. And a key consideration in this work was for all that we built to be easily deconstructed when the pilot portion of the program concluded. So to this end, we used deck panels that could interlock into adjustable pedestals that sit on top of the existing asphalt. Working with the existing grade was quite a challenge due to the very steep crown on the street, the existing crown, but the adjustable pedestals allowed the structure to be raised and also become flush with the curb, and thus more easily accessible to people. And the design, it also included a raised performance area, furniture, lighting, and bike racks. So just a little bit more detail. Jacobs provided the construction drawings, which were done in the fall of 2017. The construction took place over the winter months of 2017 and 2018, and the boardwalk was complete with, and that included the flexible tables and chairs that can be moved around per the user's comfort and needs. And we also provided built-in seating as more of a permanent part of the plaza. And you can see a beautiful picture of it right there in its final form, final for now.
Thank you. And maybe Wesley, you can kind of talk about how it's been activated in the last 2.5 years. What kind of programs or activations have happened on it, or what has it been used for?
Yeah. Going back to the comment I made about a stage for public gatherings, it's exactly what Broad has done. And when City Studio designed it, there was a space that was designed as a stage, both formally and informally. But there's been a tremendous amount of interest from groups such as Fulton County here in the photo. They have this dance thing that they do annually, and so they feature various styles of dance with different music, and they teach you how, and you can watch, and it's just really, it's a lively event. And so all the folks that you can see in the picture, unless they're standing behind the table, they had just walked up. And so the space presents the opportunity to really just become a part of something that you never really planned to do. And so there have been musicians, and there have been just all of the crazy, unexpected things that you would associate with downtown and urban environments have happened on the boardwalk.
Great, thank you. So now that the boardwalk has been built for a couple of years, is it done? Is that it, or are there other plans to make any changes to it? And I think Bette, maybe you can speak best to that.
Yeah, so since the fall of 2019, the Atlanta City Studio has been working closely with Bloomberg and Associates from New York on an approach to the second phase of the Broad Street Boardwalk. So we wanted to get a third-party objective analysis to see how the plaza was doing over the years since its implementation. And Bloomberg interviewed stakeholders and put together recommendations for how to improve the space so that the plaza can be successful long-term. And so we are now moving to procure services with the original design firm for any adjustments that need to be made so that the structure can be more sustainable long-term. And we really think that the boardwalk is this excellent first step in linking new public spaces to citywide objectives for communities and neighborhoods. And we really hope it can be used to elevate the value of public spaces citywide.
Very exciting. Well, we look forward to seeing those updates. So now let's kind of flip around to the south end of Broad Street. What's going on the south end?
Yes.
And how does what's going on there play a part in the rest of Broad Street? And April, I think if you want to take that.
Sure, I'll touch on that. So what you're looking at right here, this is essentially a map of Newport's holdings within South Downtown. So that top little M is the 5 Points MARTA station. You'll see the 3-block long Broad Street that we're talking about. But then all of the orange, everything in orange are the parcels, existing buildings that Newport owns. And the blue are parking lots or parking decks that Newport owns. So our concentration is really around 4 streets: Broad Street, Peachtree, MLK, and Mitchell. And, as one of the first steps from our perspective when we began acquiring these buildings was really understanding the relationship between the buildings and the streets. And again, how those two can work together to provide the best neighborhood for the city. Specifically for Broad Street, as part of our street concept plan, which we did for all 4 streets, we really took learnings from everything that Bette and Wesley have shared about North Broad and thought about how can we take what they've done up there and really try to think about it in the context of South Downtown, South Broad Street. So because it's a 3-block long street, it is super lightly trafficked. We felt it could play a similar role with it being pedestrian oriented. So what does that street look like if we take away the ability for cars to move through it on a daily basis? What does it look like if we decrease the curb line so it's just flush across the street? How does it look if we make it a shared street where cars and bikes and people can all interact together? So we did a lot of studying around this street, all 3 blocks, but really focused on that middle block as that is the concentration of where the current retail opportunities would be. We just saw an opportunity to build off the already artistic vibe that Broad Street had adopted. There were several arts organizations on the street when we came down there. Broad Street hosted Elevate in 2016, I believe, 2017, which was this, you can see in the bottom right picture, but this super long table with 100 people having dinner under these, in the middle of the street, under these canopies and a light installation. And, working with different organizations since we purchased the buildings on activating new murals to add additional artistic value to the street. And working with partners like City Studio or the City of Atlanta with Parking Day or the Bike Festival or Atlanta Streets Alive to figure out how do we help Broad Street reach its potential before the development is done. So that's what we've been working on since then. Again, I think the idea being that in this initial phase, we're trying to figure out some more immediate short-term steps that we can take to make Broad Street feel a little bit more alive and be utilized to its full potential, while we continue to plan for that long-term vision and seek funding to help us pay for that long-term vision. And one of the most exciting things that we have planned, I feel like, with a lot of different partners is a Saturday market. It was due to launch in March of 2020, but we all know that that was a pretty rough time. So we postponed it to March 21 and are hopeful that we can implement that market in a way that is safe, but still gives some identity to South Broad Street. So stay tuned for updates on that.
Very exciting. Well, it's appreciated that it's, your developer who is very focused on the street life and not just on the buildings you own, but what's going on outside your building and how you're connected to downtown. So that is a real benefit for the rest of downtown. So how does Broad Street, is there any connection with the rest of Atlanta? We've kind of talked about what's happening along it and how it connects to downtown, but what about connections to the greater Atlanta area? Maybe Bette, you could start out talking about that.
Yeah, so Broad Street has this great opportunity to act as a main corridor, not only for downtown, but for the entire city. It's centered in Atlanta's urban core, and its location in relation to the 5 Points MARTA station makes it a really strong connection point for all transit users. And so with these features in mind, the Department of City Planning began looking at other cities and their transit infrastructure. And so our current covered street level plaza is it's an atypical design approach when compared to the design of stations in similar transit systems. And even for major hub stations, the design approach is one where access to the station is seamlessly integrated with the surrounding public realm and the private development. So currently the station's covered street level plaza over the former Broad Street alignment both limits the potential space for additional development and also severs a key connection between downtown and South Downtown, and also, creates this sort of just a chip in the link with the rest of the cities in regards to that connection as well. So we asked, what if the station's covered plaza was removed and Broad Street was reconnected? And again, this is just an idea that the Department of City Planning developed, and we're actually working with MARTA and a team consultant to test the feasibility of. So we hope to actually have a conclusion of that study in the next few months to help us decide how to proceed. But the positive impacts would be that it would restore these two blocks of valuable urban land that could serve as a platform for new private and transit-oriented development, as well as well-designed public spaces that accommodate existing station soccer and Atlanta programs, and a starting point for a vastly improved rider experience that is seamlessly connected with the experience of downtown and South Downtown and the rest of the city.
Great, and obviously those are some major, public works infrastructure projects that would take some time to do, but it's a very exciting potential there. And April, you touched a little bit on kind of the future of what we can look for, but is there any other thoughts on, kind of what's next? What are some upcoming improvements planned? Maybe you or Wesley?
Sure. I mean, Wesley, do you want to touch on Garnett first, and then we can dig in a little bit?
Sure. So representing our friends at MARTA, we've worked with them on just looking at Garnett and focusing. It's one of the least used by daily passenger count. It's one of the least used stations in the 37 stations that MARTA operates rail at. And just acknowledging that there is not only Newport development occurring in South Downtown, but a series of other projects that are really getting legs and seeing physical growth. We're anticipating that a lot more people are going to be using this station. As it currently stands, it's somewhat walled off, challenging to get to, and just overbearing the way that it sits on the landscape. And so this slide shows a rendering of an idea that has been propositioned to MARTA about how we can not only facilitate access, but just open the station up and clear sight lines and understand that it's a transit station. I know that one of the most basic criticisms that is frequently thrown MARTA's way is when you are experiencing their stations in downtown, it just says MARTA on the signs with their traditional 3 colors. And so if you're visiting from Paris or Belgium or Australia, what the hell is MARTA? And so just the simple change of making the transit icon and just really allowing you to see where you're going before you get there. And so this drawing begins to tackle some of those challenges. And then the other aspect of the drawing I'll mention is that Greyhound is immediately south of Garnett MARTA Station. They're immediately adjacent, and they are anticipating construction of a new bus terminal in the spring of 2021. It'll be a very quick project that will essentially, they'll build on the land that is a parking lot now, and then they will flip their existing building to a bus bay area for their facility operations.
Yeah, I personally get really excited, when we think about the general partnership with MARTA and 5 Points in Garnett and what changes to those stations can mean for the neighborhood. It's just really exciting. So as it relates to Broad Street and our future planning, so we as a developer are concentrated on Mitchell Street right now, which is just a block away from Broad, and two substantial development projects there, bringing about 100,000 square feet of retail and about 250,000 square feet of office to the neighborhood in the next 18 months. So we have our hands full there, but in the meantime, we are working with several partners on figuring out, how to quickly activate Broad Street and continue to utilize its potential for public events or, art activations, or just creating a really, lovely space for people to travel between 5 Points and Mercedes-Benz Stadium again. So part of that is what I mentioned, the South Broad Street Market. That's a partnership with a local restaurateur who will be opening the first restaurant in South Downtown on Broad Street next year. But partnering with him on that market and seeing that come to life starting next year. And then I mentioned, aside from that, that street was really adopted by arts organizations prior to us purchasing those buildings. And I saw a question come up, so I'll go ahead and address it. But several of those organizations in the past couple of years have moved out. We do have Murmur still on the street and are excited that they've been able to maintain their position there. Atlanta City Studio has joined us. And then we had an arts group called Practice Over Practice that was in a location for a little bit. And we hope that they will be returning after the pandemic. Then there was a fourth one, it's actually two more, Broad Street Visitor Center, which is a small recording studio. And then in another building, we offered the group Here Atlanta, which is an immersive theater group, the opportunity to use one of our buildings as their landing ground for the past year. So while we haven't been able to retain all of the arts groups in the neighborhood, we have continued to invite new ones in and are excited to make sure arts and culture are interwoven into the immediate plans and future sustainable plans for the street.
Great, and I think we have a way that we can solicit kind of some public feedback on some of the future plans. If maybe Wesley, you want to talk about what this is.
So Councilmember Winslow, who presides over the southern portion of Broad Street, Council District 4 within the city of Atlanta, had received money, as all of the other council members have received, through the Renew Atlanta bond, and that the expenditure allowed the council members to decide a small portion of the budget what they wanted to be spent on. And so seeing the efforts that are going into Broad, Councilmember Winslow assigned a couple $100,000 to this segment of Broad between MLK and Mitchell. And City Studio, Newport, and CAP 80ID are now working to figure out what the public wants. So before we make any moves or spend the first dollar, just trying to capture the interest of the general public. And so we have had this survey up since the beginning of the month. We are planning several meetings with the residential communities of Broad Street and the surrounding areas, the Neighborhood Association, NPU, and anyone that'll take the survey. It was featured, the project was featured in AJC a couple weeks ago. And every time we get an opportunity to talk about it, we are encouraging folks to just tell us what they want. And just hopefully this will lead towards some immediate action. We're looking to spend the money relatively quickly after the survey results are in, and it'll just be a point where we can continue to grow and invest in Broad and all of South Downtown.
Thank you. And I think Vanessa posted the link in the chat to the survey. We would really appreciate it if everybody on the call could go to that website and provide some feedback. It would be really great to hear from you all. So we're going to get to the questions. If you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. You can continue to put them there. We have some good ones already. But before we do that, I just wanted to see if anyone had any kind of final thoughts, or another big question is maybe like lessons learned. You know, we've all been kind of working together on this for a few years now. So are there any takeaways or lessons or anything we didn't get to in the discussion that you want to address?
Yeah, I'll kick that off. So I'll say for us, again, we're a private investor. So we own property, just happens to be a lot of it in this neighborhood. And one of the biggest things that has been of value to us is partnerships like that you're seeing on this phone call. So between Atlanta City Studio and the City of Atlanta, Central Atlanta Progress and the Downtown Improvement District, MARTA, as I mentioned, it's essential. We realize in order for us to do this well, we don't have all the answers. And so it's essential for us to work with city partners who have similar goals and vision, although maybe a little bit different, and that's healthy, to work together collaboratively to come to the best results. So we're just really grateful and feel like we're in a really special position in the city of Atlanta to have such strong partners that are so design and pedestrian and urban focused. because it completely aligns with the vision of our leadership and what we're hopeful to do down here.
Yeah, and so I'll say from the studio's perspective, one of our major takeaways from looking at this at Broad Street was to really look at the design of the entire stretch of the street and how that translates into a healthy public realm that encourages connections between people and spaces and encourages transit use and just improves the overall experience. And, you know, one can look at Broad Street and break it out into its many varied, unique parts. But here, what proved important was to take a step back and look at how it functions as a whole. And so we're really looking towards a future that reconnects downtown and South Downtown, and what that reconnection means for the experience for the public.
And I'll just add a tidbit that I feel as though much of Atlanta is painted with a broad brush of suburban, whitewashed, and somewhat generic. I think that Broad is really an opportunity to really recreate a fine, granular, these small historic buildings are incredible assets to the downtown community, and for Newport and all other partners to take interest, I think that we're really creating something that's going to be really special, although it's going to take some time.
Yes, definitely. And then I've had some tangential experience with Broad Street, managing Woodruff Park, which is right across the street from it. I mostly am focused on events and programming, but have definitely been able to watch the recent evolutions of Broad Street. And my biggest takeaways are kind of understanding that the design of the space, the physicality is really just one piece of the puzzle, and that the City Studio did an amazing job, providing a great design there, and that there's also the matter of ongoing maintenance, oversight, activation, permitting, policing, what kind of policing, social service outreach. You know, there's an immense amount of coordination that goes into managing a public space once it has been designed and built. And it requires a lot of coordination with key stakeholders to just kind of witness all that coordination happening, all the meetings that happen with all these people around the table, has been a very eye-opening to see, how many ongoing resources it takes. And I think ideally community feedback works to help relieve, any of that coordination that needs to happen, but it's also an ever-evolving process. As Wesley mentioned, it's kind of in the beginning of this kind of current form, as we heard about, like all the rich history it has, but it does feel like it's kind of at the cusp of a new life. So that is very exciting to see. So again, I hope the people that haven't been will come downtown and visit, and also fill out the survey. But we'd love to get to some of your questions now. And I believe, Vanessa, did you want to chime in with the question?
Yeah, I can read the questions. So we've been gathering the questions that have come through the chat, and I'll kind of go here in order, and I consolidated a couple of the comments that were about the same subject. So the first comment is really about having too much parking, especially around MARTA stations. And I know just from knowing CAP's master plan that it calls for district parking and developing residential spine where we currently have parking lots. So Wesley, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more into CAP's vision regarding consolidating parking spaces and then replacing that with some much needed development.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that a lot of the parking, fortunately or unfortunately, is privately held. So a lot of the decision making that goes on with whether or not to allow some land to be designated for parking is a private decision that's usually market driven. I will add on to that by saying there are members of our team that are working to set the market conditions in a way that are encouraging less and less parking, especially considering how well connected the heart of downtown is to transit. And what else was I going to mention? I think that, and April, you can chime in with better specifics, but I think that Newport is well aware of the assets that they sit on, and not that they sit on, that they own, and do not plan to sit on them. But it just takes time, as I was mentioning, to develop the appropriate market conditions to act on those investments.
Yeah, Wesley, that was a great intro. So if you recall that map, I mentioned all the blue boxes were parking parcels that we owned. It's about a little over 4 acres of land that's dedicated to parking. And for us in the immediate future, it certainly is going to help, for our office and retail tenants to have parking spaces. But definitely in the future, the reason we purchased those is because we feel like they're incredible development sites, and which is why Garnet MARTA Station is such an active part of our conversations. So most of our parking is to the south, and we have really liberal zoning here, and so we're able to build, just like the middle of the city should, tall buildings, mixed use. And so we see our biggest opportunity for residential in those lots, because many of our current buildings are old wood, long and skinny buildings, and most people like daylight in their apartments. So they just don't set up well for redeveloping them as apartment units. But our major residential footprint will be on those parking lots, and we do plan, that is an active part of our master planning development. I will say the other thing that, some people may not realize or think about is that while we may have really aggressive goals for minimizing parking ratios in residential or office or retail, the financing world does not necessarily see it the same. So, in order to produce these new projects and redevelop these buildings, any bank that we get lended from is going to require a certain amount of parking because they feel it's market standard. So they're not going to lend against something that has a 0 parking ratio, even if we can prove that we're next to 2 MARTA stations. So it is definitely like a cyclical conversation between what we think is right, what the city is giving us permission to do, and then how the banks will lend against that.
Thank you, April and Wesley. And April, I think your answer for this also touches on a little bit of another question, which was regarding the development mix of having office in retail versus residential. And so I think you spoke to that with the existing buildings and what they lend themselves to versus new construction opportunities there. The other question also for Newport, and April, I know you touched on this as well, is around the arts and culture. Anything else around efforts that were made to retain existing communities or opportunities to continue to work with arts and culture communities in the future that you have not yet shared with us?
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to go into a lot more detail of the process, but Mammal Gallery and iDrum were 2 really well-known established art groups when we purchased the buildings. Unfortunately, in the way that they had their leases signed with previous owners, it put all of the building maintenance and renovations on the tenant. And the buildings are old. The owners didn't care. And so the buildings just were in really poor condition, and honestly just not safe. And safety of our tenants is a #1 priority for Newport. And so as we did some initial evaluation of buildings, the cost to get those up to safety code was just so huge that it didn't make sense for those organizations to try to fundraise to meet those demands. However, I will say that we worked really hard with both organizations through that time. I hope that, Mammal specifically would say that, we tried to keep them in a neighborhood and other buildings, but they they dreamt bigger. And so we just didn't have a space that could accommodate what they wanted their future footprint to be. And thankfully they found it at the Met just down the street. I hope that they are able to work out a long-term deal there. But certainly for the ones that we have been able to retain, Murmur, Broad Street Visitor Center, using them and then building off of that, trying to use any building we have that is safe for community good. So the arts organization Dashboard has had a residency for the past year in 186 Mitchell. And while COVID certainly impacted their programming, they are finishing out the year strong with an artist in that space. And then, as I mentioned, the other two here at Atlanta was in the old HL Green building. They've been in that space for the past year. And then we've worked with muralists to continue bringing vibrancy to the sides of our buildings. So we are trying to use assets that we have for community good while doing it in the safest way possible.
Thank you so much, April. Our next question is about preservation. And I'll open this up to the whole panel, whoever wants to speak to it, to speak to how preservation is going to influence and enhance the cultural heritage of these spaces, and what does that mean for future involvement. And there's also a comment here about the importance of connecting it to our history. And there's a mention to future places, which I can put in the chat here, a good contact person for you all who are interested in finding out more about that project.
I'll take a stab at that one and just acknowledge that going back to the title of this presentation, while we work to right size, so to speak, the public spaces and our transportation means to the historic buildings, I think that is the first critical step, making sure that people can get to and from these spaces in a way that makes sense for now and for the future. And so our plans that we are advancing with the city and Newport seek to not only accommodate cars, but to accommodate more pedestrians, more scooters, more bikes, more bus stops, more rail passengers. And I think that's the first step in making sure that our historic assets are able to stay in place and be cherished.
And I'll just mention briefly from the city's side, we work very closely with our historic preservation team, collaborate with them. When we were, pre-COVID and working out of our space on Broad Street Southwest, where we were meeting with them on a weekly basis, and we collaborate with them and provide input to each other. Whenever we're starting to, when we were focusing on our location on Broad Street Southwest specifically, and also we have a really great public arts manager, and I think she in every way possible will wiggle in a way to kind of celebrate through the arts, whether it be in murals or just any sort of artistic expression that we can implement in a project, kind of thinking about what's cohesive with the neighborhood. Can it touch on those historical aspects and really fusing those concepts together, in addition to just celebrating what's currently there and the beautiful architecture that exists.
Thank you. And there's some great discussion in the chat. I just want to be aware of time. We have about a little less than 5 minutes left. So Vanessa, maybe you could pick one more question for us to tackle, but make sure you guys check out the chat for some good suggestions. And also, again, people have great suggestions. Please, fill out the feedback survey and help share some of your ideas there too.
Yeah, I think the other big topic here in the chat is really around affordable housing and understanding the connection of that to transit and how important it is to really have housing that is close to transit into MARTA. I'm not sure that we can speak to MARTA's efforts around TOD since we don't have a representative here today. But I know, Ansley, you were going to mention some of the work that city planning is doing and really understanding more around this issue.
Ansley, did you want to jump in, or I can talk a little bit about Newport's role?
Yeah, April, go ahead.
Okay. So I'll say first of all that, you know, Newport understands the importance of having affordability, especially in an 8-block area of our urban core. So it is one of our main principles that, you know, we keep at the foundation of our planning work. And I think that goes from a residential perspective and a commercial perspective. And so we look at it from all angles. I'll say that we do, you know, the city and Invest Atlanta are, you know, definitely trying to think about ways to help developers like us offset some of that expense of, you know, restoring these old buildings is not inexpensive. So helping us think through, what does that look like? How can we make sure that we provide great product while also providing some affordable mix? And so, you know, I'll just say that it continues to be a priority for us. And we know that, but we also know that we can't solve everything ourselves. So we're definitely looking around at other development partners that surround South Downtown and trying to collaborate with them on what their, you know, trends that they're seeing or things that they're trying in the same way to make sure that we provide an affordable mix both in residential and commercial spaces.
Great, thank you. And the City Studio has currently a book club running, and the book is The Color of Law, which is a really remarkable book that outlines issues with affordable housing and how it, you know, kind of the history of it and leading to today, what can be done about it. So please, if you have any interest in affordable housing and want to get together with a group of people to talk about it, what it means for Atlanta, please check out the City Studios social media for more information on that. But it's a great opportunity to really dive deep into this topic. And if you can't do that, still check out the book anyways. It's a really fabulous book. So I just want to thank all the panelists, April and Wesley and Bette. Thank you guys so much. Also, thank you to the Atlanta Design Festival for giving us the opportunity to talk about this very special street in downtown Atlanta. And I hope you all can take our survey, can come visit, and, you know, check out the chat as we're kind of closing for, you know, people's final thoughts. And thank you to all the participants who came and watched this today. And I hope that everyone has a great rest of their week. And April, time for the dances now. We promised. I promised everybody. So.
Oh, we're out of time, guys. Zoom calls.
Oh no!
Sorry. So sorry. Thanks, everybody. This was great. I put my email address in the chat, so please reach out if you want to continue conversation or whatever. Like to come down here to tour some of our buildings.
All right, thanks to everybody.